There's some echo, I think.
Is it clear?
So I think we've just gone live, and there is some echo on your end, Petula. Because we'll just begin.
Right.
It's better, yeah. Right. So I think we'll begin because it's 10:30 and we'll start the session right now. Hi and good morning to all of you. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone here today for the webinar, which is focused on HR and employment during COVID, organized by KSK in association with the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce. There is no better way to begin this session than by quoting our Honorable Prime Minister for the post that went viral last evening when making reference to the Honorable Prime Minister of Australia's post on Twitter. And I quote, "Connected by the Indian Ocean, united by the Indian samosa. We surely hope that great things progress and the Indo-Australian relationship continues to grow." This webinar focuses on HR and employment issues, more particularly the obligations and responsibilities of employers towards their employees, and the legal framework for dealing with issues in both India and Australia. This webinar will also provide a detailed insight on ease of doing business in India and Australia, and finally, will provide a comprehensive and thorough understanding of the steps taken by the governments of these countries in dealing with the COVID situation. Before I jump into the event, and most importantly, let me introduce myself. My name is Aurelia Menezes, and I'm a partner with Stubb Kasiva Advocates. I will be your moderator today. My background is in transactional matters, including M&As, corporate and commercial and employment and labor laws. Before I take the opportunity to introduce our esteemed panel, I would like to introduce Ms. Petula Thomas, Director, India and Australia from the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce, who will provide the opening remarks for the session today. Petula leads on creating the Chamber's strategic vision and delivery of its key initiatives and engagements across governments and businesses. Prior to joining the IACC in November 2018, Petula worked with the British Deputy High Commission, Australian Trade and Investment Commission, and British Airways over 15 years and brings a wealth of experience in strategic relationship, leadership, international relations, and business development. She has held an exceptional track record and has been recognized for her services by various international organizations. Petula is passionate about women in leadership and enjoys traveling. Welcome, Petula. Over to you. I think she's just... don't think we have her. Maybe we can get to the opening remarks when she joins back, because she seemed to disconnect. So we'll get back to her and probably have her speak in a bit. Anyway, moving forward, the timing of this event coincides with the staggered opening of Indian economy in phases, with most industries, both in the manufacturing and service sector, likely to kick off even before we have a handle on the epidemic. To discuss this and more, I think I'm going to go back to Petula because she's just joined the panel again. Petula, we've done your introduction, and we are going to have you provide your opening remarks for this session. That's not happening. Things wrong. Okay, we're going to move ahead and probably have Petula speak later or at the end of the session. So I will repeat myself. The timing of this event coincides with the staggered opening of Indian economy in phases, with most industries, both in the manufacturing and service sector, likely to kick off even before we have a handle on the epidemic. To discuss this and more, we have with us a distinguished panel of guests representing the legal fraternity and specializing in handling labor and employment issues. Before I introduce them to you, I wanted to go through a few housekeeping items and share the format in which we will be conducting this session. The entire session will be 1 hour in duration, with the first 35 to 40 minutes parked for discussion with the panel, after which I will be throwing the floor open for questions. I will encourage you to post your questions in the live chat box, which you can see on your screens. Once the discussions with the panelists is complete, we will open the floor for questions for 15 to 20 minutes. Let me now proceed to introduce our panel here today. Moving in alphabetical order, we have Rachel. Rachel is the head of legal Asia Pacific at Infosys. Rachel is a senior in-house lawyer with almost 20 years experience in supporting her many diverse clients to deliver value to their customers. She currently leads the Infosys Asia Pacific Legal and Government Affairs practice. Before joining Infosys, Rachel held roles that included senior positions with the Australian Government Solicitor and the Commonwealth Government, private practice, and a variety of roles in IT, telecommunication, and consulting. Rachel has passion for technology and gadgets and classical music and currently lives in Sydney. We welcome you, Rachel, to this session. Also joining us is Rahul. Who is the partner of a global law firm, Square Pattern Box, and is based in Sydney. Rahul is a leading hospitality and real estate transactions lawyer with over 15 years of legal experience and advises clients across the full project lifecycle, including joint venture structuring and investment, property law and due diligence, acquisitions, sales, hotel management agreements, developments, foreign investments, and licensing. He is recommended in the Legal 500 Asia Pacific 2018 in Real Estate Australia. We welcome you, Rahul. Next, we have Rajesh Sivaswamy, Senior Partner at Stubb Kasiva Advocates. With over 20 plus years experience in legal, Rajesh focuses primarily on mergers and acquisitions, private equity, divestitures, and sales of businesses, joint ventures, strategic alliances, and in particular with emphasis on cross-border transactions. He is also one of the co-editors of the Ramaya's Guide to Company Law. Welcome, Rajesh. Finally, to complete our panel, we have Satyajit Gupta, awarded for his corporate and M&A expertise. Satyajit is a dual qualified lawyer in India and England with nearly 17 years work experience in top law practices and is now the Vice President, Assistant GC and Head of India Legal at EXL Service, a NASDAQ listed company focusing on operations management and analytics. Welcome, Satyajit, to our panel. Since I think we all have a brief introduction of our panelists and we all know that they are really good in their field and are advisable to talk on HR and labor and employment. So without any further ado, I'm going to dive straight in and kick off this town hall. I think before we understand practical implications and aspects of rights and responsibilities of employers and employees, and the relationship between India and Australia in general, including the ease of doing business in these countries, it is imperative to understand the legal framework of labor and employment. So let me pose these questions now directly to Rahul. Rahul, if you could give us a brief of how the legal structure in Australia works in such matters, it will surely set the pace for this session. Can we have your thoughts?
Hi, Aurelia. Thank you. It would be my pleasure to give you a bit of an outline of the legal framework here in Australia. And thank you to you and Rajesh for organizing this event, and pleasure to join the other panelists. In Australia, we have a highly regulated environment, I think one of the most so across the world. I would describe the structure as a pyramid structure where we have a Commonwealth or federal legislation at the top, and then each of our states and territories have legislation that they have implemented on a state and territory basis. The principal legislation is called the Fair Work Act in 2009, and there is the Fair Work Regulations. And it's the main legislation that applies to all, or most, I should say, employee-employer relationships, and applies to most employees across the country. It's there to govern the relationship between employers and employees. It's there to provide a framework that sets out the minimum standards, minimum remuneration requirements, deals with items such as discrimination, work conditions, and other certain requirements. And the reason I say certain specific requirements is because then the states and territories implement particular requirements themselves. So it also deals with, for example, flexible working arrangements. It essentially contemplates a fair work system that is governed by 5 principal industry bodies, the Fair Work Ombudsman, the Fair Work Commission, and 3 other relevant bodies, including a court, a federal court that applies. Probably the one that I would highlight there is the Fair Work Commission, which has a number of roles in relation to employment arrangements, approvals of new arrangements, and implementing changes. The Ombudsman obviously acts as a regulatory body to oversee due process and appropriate compliance with the Fair Work Act. I would say relevantly to our present circumstances, on the 9th of April, the federal government passed an amendment to the Fair Work Act, which deals with, I would say in particular, COVID-19, but what we call here the Job Keeper scheme, which is designed to keep or allow employers additional financial support to keep people employed with regulated stand-down arrangements that apply. There's a little bit more detail I'll go to as we continue, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a picture, and I can speak to some of the particular legal arrangements that will apply to an employee in due course.
That's perfect, Rahul. Thank you for giving us that insight into the legal structure. Before we delve into more topics such as the rights and duties and responsibilities of employers, employees, it's also important to understand the other side of the ocean, which is going to be India. And let me pose this question to you, Satyajit, because that would be really helpful if you could give us an insight into the legal structure or the legal framework of HR and employment in India and how that works.
Sure, Aurelia. And first of all, thank you again for organizing this. So to sort of in a sense summarize, the Indian Constitution provides certain powers to both the central government, with at the federal level, as well as the states, to regulate and to enact suitable legislation to govern and protect the rights of employees, and of course to create employment opportunities depending on the type of industry, nature of work, number of employees, location, remuneration of the employees, etc. Different legislation have been enacted. At the central level, there's of course the Industrial Disputes Act, which governs the relationship of the employer-employee. There's of course the Factories Act, which governs manufacturing establishments. At the state level, there are the Shops and Establishments Acts, which have been governed by and enacted by the different states. There are, of course, again, certain state amendments, state-specific amendments to the central legislations as well. Now, broadly, another important consideration to keep in mind, before we get into more detail, and probably for me to end the Indian part, is the distinction in the Indian context, between a workman and and a non-workman. Now, in India, the industrial legislation protection has been given largely to blue-collar workers, who are referred to as workmen in our legislation. In the recent or proposed amendments, this has been changed to worker, obviously keeping in mind that to make it more probably gender neutral. But usually these are expected to be non-managerial, manual or unskilled, technical or operational, clerical work, including, in certain cases, it could even include certain supervisory work, but obviously excludes purely managerial work, which falls into the white-collar category. And I think basis that, we will later, I think in the segment, get into the rights and obligations of employers versus employees. But that broadly, I think, sums up how things go. There are, of course, separate labor courts. There, of course, there are conciliation proceedings, etc., which are set up under the different legislation and the different authorities, both under the states as well as the central government, to administer these and enforce these laws. So that's from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Sajid. I think very well explained. I think this has set the tone of our discussions because it is very important to understand the legal framework of both countries before we actually go into understanding more extensively on the relationship and the trade between the countries and ease of doing business, including rights and duties of employers and employees, which I'm sure our audience are waiting for. Let me cut this in a little bit in between abruptly here because I do not want to ruin the flow for the rest of the session. So I'm going to, luckily we have Petula back, and she seemed to have a connection issue, but I think that's sorted now. So I'm going to introduce Petula because she's going to provide the opening remarks for the session. And Petula has a very impressive profile, which I'm going to let you know about shortly. Petula is leading on creating the Chamber's strategic vision and delivery of key initiatives and engagements across governments and businesses. Prior to joining the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce, she joined that in about November 2018. Petula worked with the British Deputy High Commission, Australian Trade and Investment Commission, and British Airways for over 15 years, and brings a wealth of experience in strategic leadership, international relations, and business development. She has held an exceptional track record and has been recognized for her services by various international organizations. Welcome, Petula. We look forward for the opening remarks.
Thank you, Aurelia, and hello to everyone. Good morning to those in India and good afternoon to those in Australia. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And King Stubb Kasiva has been a member of the Chamber for a year now. We value that membership and interaction. And I think I'd like to commend you on this initiative, as I'm sure most of us would agree that to win in the marketplace, you must first win in the workplace. So COVID-19 has been challenging. It's been challenging for government. It's been challenging for businesses and for people. And as we begin to turn our minds towards the reopening of the economy and workplace, I think we need to be as best prepared as we can to respond, be it unexpected legislative changes or workplace challenges. So I just heard when I joined in a bit later as well, but I did hear a mention of some of the government aid that was available and support. I just like to say that as we know, the Indian government has issued various advisories and directions and come out with a fiscal stimulus package. And now there are questions around how employees would meet the wage liability during this period. The Australian federal government's JobKeeper subsidy looks to support businesses through the coronavirus pandemic. The state governments have also come out with their own economic measures and incentives. I think one point that I'd be looking for from the panelists is to throw some light upon the new challenges that come up now with this situation. I know as chair of the Learning and Development and HR Committee in my previous role with the British High Commission in India, we focused a lot on not just providing management the guidance, but also to look at how we could best support employees and give them the tools they need. So I think all of us would agree that we've made this rapid transition to an almost entire remote workforce very quickly. But have we considered the cybersecurity challenges that it brings? Are our workforce trained in that? What about digital leadership and other gaps? Has HR identified that, the skill set that's required in this digital transformation era? So I'd leave it with that. I'll leave with those thoughts, and I'd really look forward to the expert panels. Well done again to all of you, for being here, to having this to come up with this initiative. And I think it'll really give us the tools that we need to carry on from here on. And I think HR isn't just the thing that we do. It's the thing that, runs our business. It is the heart of what we do. So thank you.
Have to completely agree with you, Petula. Thank you so much. HR definitely is the heart of every business. Of course, no one can function without it. It is labor that is most important. It is control over labor, regulations, compliance that is more important. So we definitely are in agreement with you, and we look forward to hear from the expert panel on today's topics, because they're of great interest during these stressful times for a lot of employers, corporations, employees themselves, and the government and various other businesses, both in the manufacturing service sector, even when it comes to law firms, the IT sector, any other sector for that matter. So thank you so much for your opening remarks. We'll surely try to incorporate these points and during our panel discussion today. Thank you. I would like to move on now, and let's focus on the next area of our key topics of discussion points for today, which would to briefly be to touch upon the rights and responsibilities of employers and employees, both in India and in Australia. And in light of the legal framework that was just discussed by Rahul and Satyajit, I'm going to go back and pose this question to Rahul once again, since he gave us a perspective of the legal framework in Australia. So Rahul, has the government, by virtue of laws, regulations, notifications, or any other government orders, issued directives for employers during the pandemic, or does it just arise out of, say, existing legislations which are there? What are the steps taken to identify the obligations and responsibilities of employers? Are there any due to the government interfering and passing regulations, or if you could throw more light on that, as well as what are the rights if the employees have any during this situation? If you could let us know on that, it'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Aurelia. And Petula, thanks for your kind introduction. I think it really does set the scene, which is about returning to work, however that may be, whatever area of work you're in. So Aurelia, to your question, I guess, yes, there are obviously strong ongoing obligations on employers in respect of, I would say right now, particular work health and safety, but as well as what is the role, the scope of the role being redefined as in that the new world order of returning to work in the new environment that one is working in. I think with that comes a question about flexibility and a greater focus, particularly in Australia, on flexible work arrangements and the impact that might have on workspaces and use of space and so on. Perhaps I'd take a quick step back to the structure I mentioned before, the pyramid structure, just to give a bit more of a scene. We have the Fair Work Act at the federal level. We then have modern awards that are determined based on either an industry or a nature of someone's role. So for example, in the hospitality industry, where I spend a lot of my time working, the Hospitality Industry General Award is a relevant award that will apply to many employees who are in the hospitality space. And there are a number of other awards based on industry and nature of work. A group of employees within a particular job or employer may be subject to an enterprise agreement, which sets up particular terms relating to them and their cohorts' terms of employment. That enterprise agreement is usually approved or will need to be approved by the Fair Work Commission, the body I mentioned earlier. And relevantly, that's the terms under that enterprise agreement need to put the employee in no worse a position than they were under the modern awards. Essentially, it would be overall a beneficial type arrangement. And then there's the employment contract. So when we're looking back to your question of what's the impact, it's an employer will need to look at the various, both the legislation as well as awards that may apply, and to the employment contract. What we've seen at a government level, federal government level, is the Job Keeper program that I mentioned earlier, and Petula also mentioned, which is focused on supporting employers to retain employees by essentially, I would say the term would be underwriting a minimum salary for a period of time. And during that period, an employee may be on reduced hours or may be stood down and not working at the office, although they remain employed. During that period, they will still be receiving the benefits of entitlements, such as leave entitlements and so on. And obviously, as the workplace is, or the business is able to be re-triggered, we'll be able to look back at coming back to work in whatever form that return will take. So I think that's probably the most relevant piece. We haven't, I mentioned earlier, we do on a state and territory basis the implementation of federal directives and so on. So we haven't had a formal lockdown of all office space in Sydney, for example, or in New South Wales, but we have rules on gatherings and how many people per square meter and social distancing requirements and so on. So particularly for, and we have had closures of certain types of venues, for example, bars, restaurants, food and beverage, conference type facilities. So where there are specific government directives, there is under this JobKeeper program the ability of an employer to issue essentially a stand down arrangement. So you will need to, as an employer, have a particular reason, not due to general business downturn and not due to inaction or something you have done that's caused the downturn. The return, and we're seeing it from the 1st of June, is already changes in terms of reopenings and wider openings of venues in the first place. Office spaces, we're expecting, people haven't been forced not to go to the office. And so, for example, in my office, we have a limited staff there who are available to support the team of working from home. And we'll slowly, gradually get people back on deck. But that will be in a staged way. That will be having regard to health and safety responsibilities, transport requirements of staff, and flexible requirements staff might have, particularly if they have elderly people they're taking care of, or they have particular concern with the continued existence of the pandemic.
Great, Rahul. I think that was very, very insightful. And I also believe that this has a lot more, this is more to do with the structure that is there available in India as well. And I think I'll then pose this question to Satyajit because I believe the Indian-Australian structures and what the government does to combat this and the employees and employees relationship, the rights, the obligations, workplace safety, as you just rightly mentioned, is the same that we have here also, Satyajit. And if you could just throw some light on that, it would be great from an Indian perspective.
Sure, Aurelia. Thanks. And Rahul obviously summarized the Australian position very brilliantly. India's taken a lot from Australia over the years. I mean, just as an aside, one of my papers in law school was comparative constitutions, and Australian constitution was one of the few which I sort of looked up to a lot. So, but I think there are similarities and there are differences, and I will sort of briefly touch upon a few. I think, and perhaps just look at probably practically how things have panned out as well. Of course, in the context of the Indian regulations. Now, the Indian, sort of government was pretty quick in terms of, when they did come up with the lockdown notifications to push and to sort of inspire and motivate employers to move to a work from home situation fairly quickly. And I think that was definitely, required. And I think that push really helped, I think, initially in terms of ensuring that the numbers and the spread of the disease initially was controlled. And I think definitely work from home was something which was pushed by, specifically in my sector, which was the IT/ITS sector, by the Indian Department of Telecommunications, allowing work from home immediately without requiring a certain with some minimal security requirements, and which was well received by the companies. However, I think in terms of the other regulations which the government extended, which obviously cautioned employers against layoffs, cautioned employers against reduction of wages, cautioned employers against and advised employers to continue to pay wages through the lockdown. While I do agree most larger and probably mid-sized corporations and companies did adhere to it, I know most law firms also adhered to it, so that was great. but the small size and the micro enterprises found it difficult because I think the government support came rather late. So the government did also extend support in terms of giving certain, SOCs, for example, for companies which were enterprises which were less than 100 members strong with salaries of less than 15,000 rupees per month. They were given, support by the government on the Provident Fund, Employee Provident Fund contributions. There were support given much later to other entities in terms of only post May did we get certain cuts on the Provident Fund, obligations for larger companies. So I think that part being what it is, there was of course a lot of guidance around workplace safety, employee transportation, of course, and from central to the state to district governments, there's been a lot of guidance around that. I think in terms of look at, I think to go back to my distinction which I made between workers and non-workers, the protection which was given definitely was intended largely to extend to the workers in terms of non-separation during this period, in terms of payments having to be made, etc. The government did attempt to continue to support the blue-collar employees in terms of both ensuring that they got paid through this period, and also in terms of ensuring that and that those payments, etc., would also create liquidity in the hands of the consumers, because ultimately I think this when workers don't get paid, I think the other implication is of course on the fact that the economy as a whole suffers. And finally, I think the other area where I think we are slightly dissimilar perhaps to Australia is the number of people that we have. Our population is sort of obviously, there's no comparison. And I think the amount of migrant labor which we have. So I think that's somewhere where I think, and they're largely in the unregulated space. And that's somewhere where we could have probably done a little better. But I mean, in the last few weeks, there's been probably last month, there's been a lot of progress around that. So I think, broadly, to sum up, there's been a lot of leadership with the government, in fact, down to the local governments have shown. And, and I think we have them to thank as well in terms of ensuring that a number of, and a lot of our employees have stayed protected, have received, their salaries and, have managed to keep the livelihoods going. But yes, of course, much more can be done and much more should be done, because I'm sure, while we are going into an opening up, we could see, a larger number of cases coming up. And of course, the impact will be probably felt much more. Back to you, Aurelia.
Perfect, Satyajit. I'm going to have to agree with you on that because, yes, the government has faced a lot of criticism when it came to migrant workers, and they've done very poorly there. But it's just the hope that remains that they're going to do something more, and I see light at the end of the tunnel because this is where they're starting to take some initiatives, and let's just be hopeful about it in the next coming days and weeks. It's already too late, but let's be hopeful and hope for the best. Thank you for providing your insights, both Rahul and Satyajit. It was great to hear from an Australian and Indian perspective. Wonderful, and I think it has really benefited our audience. I would now, without wasting any further time, because we want to keep the floor open for a lot of questions from our audience. And so moving on, I would like to take my next question to Rachel. So Rachel, I want to understand from you, how has the Australian government particularly taken any steps or has helped combat this COVID virus? And how has this helped corporations, more particularly employers? Also, if you could share your thoughts and your inputs on the ease of doing business in Australia. So that'd be very helpful to hear from you, Rachel. Over to you.
Thank you, Aurelia, and thank you to the IACC and KSK for inviting me here to speak today. I might take your second question first, Aurelia, because it resonates well with what Rahul's already talked about a little bit. Australia is quite an interesting and easily accessible place to do business generally. So we have a very robust and accessible regulatory environment. I think that the things that we see here in Australia allowing us to do business generally are logical and quite accessible to any kind of foreign company. For example, like Infosys. Infosys is a foreign company that does business here in Australia and utilises the Australian regulatory environment in order to do that. So while I agree with Rahul that our regulatory environment is actually very robust with over 11 different agencies that plug into that regulatory structure, I think that it is actually accessible to overseas companies. The majority of our business structures for international companies coming and doing business in Australia are actually based on foreign companies coming in doing business in their normal business structure. You can either continue doing business as a registered foreign company in Australia, register with ASIC, or you can incorporate a new subsidiary here in Australia. And there are a couple of environments that deal with those different structures. So I think, and from my personal experience working in this area for a number of different foreign entities, that there is flexibility in Australia to do business. The regulatory scheme, that's something else. So as Rahul sort of alluded to, with our dual structure, and I don't want to go back over the legal structure of Australia, but with the dual federal and state structure, there are some complexities for employers doing business here. At one level, you have the federal government regulating a whole different variety of requirements, such as tax, employment at a higher level, certain other assessment agencies, the Federal Foreign Investment Review Board, the ASX, the Reserve Bank of Australia, the ACCC and ASIC. So all of those institutions are very relevant in how employers can come and do business as a foreign company in Australia. Every single one of them has relevance. And interestingly, as part of the COVID measures, we've seen the Foreign Investment Review Board have their threshold reduced from a seemingly quite low investment threshold of around $80,000 to zero. That means every foreign investment that comes into Australia is vetted by the government. So we're seeing that the emergency measures have had an impact on doing business in Australia, but not an unreasonable or an unmanageable sort of impact. The other interesting thing for businesses doing, foreign businesses doing business in Australia that we've seen is that we have a number of regulators in this space that have requirements such as the immigration requirements in Australia. So as a lawyer working in a foreign company, we've had a lot of questions about validity of visas and how do we deal with visas in this space and how do we protect people who work for our company who may not be domiciled in Australia as citizens or permanent residents. So I'm talking specifically about the TSS class visa or the former 457 visa. We've had a lot of discussion as a group with the government to see whether they could put in blanket changes, and we've seen that that there hasn't been a move to blanket changes in extensions to visas. What we have seen is a different class of visa arising to deal with people who may have no time left on their visas, so they can apply for the COVID visa to extend their stays in Australia. We've seen also the setup of the National Cabinet. The National Cabinet in Australia has seen the inclusion of states. This is unprecedented in the history of federated Australia, where we have a federal government inviting heads of state government to come and participate in the dialogue of what is happening around Australia at this point in time. We're seeing the Prime Minister engaging with each state head and, very importantly, allowing them flexibility in how they they deal with issues around COVID. So all of it, and I think Rahul alluded to this in his brief speech, but we've got local governments, not local, state governments, actually prescribing times and numbers of people that can actually get together. The reintroduction of more social events is actually happening quite rapidly here in New South Wales. In Victoria, it's happening a little bit slower. In Queensland, it's happening on par with New South Wales. We've seen border closures across the western borders of our eastern seaboard states. So the borders to South Australia, Western Australia and the Northern Territory are not yet open. However, there is free trade going on basically across the eastern seaboard. Interestingly, we have a new framework that the Prime Minister has put in place, the 3-step framework for a COVID-safe Australia, and this is the roadmap to opening up the free trade between the states and also more social interaction, better return to work activities. I was speaking to a colleague from the Commonwealth Government late last week, and he indicated to me that it was surprising to him that the Commonwealth Government throughout this period of COVID has not actually shut their offices at all. So they've continued to work in the work environment. Like most businesses in Australia, the Commonwealth Government has actually independently staggered work around them, but it hasn't been a mandate from government. I think that question came up a little bit earlier in the discourse. All agencies, all businesses are free to drive their own agenda in returning to work. One thing that I will bring your attention to, if we can go to my slide 5, that would be great. I think you've just skipped past it. You're on the appendix slide. Many of you will have seen that there is a virtual summit that is set to take place on the 4th of June between the Indian and the Australian governments. So we have been asked, Infosys in particular has been asked to put forward key asks around that. So as I mentioned, we were talking about and requesting further flexibility around visa extensions with a view to blanket extensions. This is to ensure that we see health and safety of the people, particularly Indian nationals who are working here. Obviously, that's our agenda in Australia with Infosys, to ensure that we have better and more accessible extension rights, because right now every visa is being extended on a case-by-case basis. So that's actually, you know, quite a heavy burden on individual employers like Infosys or like other Indian headquartered companies who have a large workforce based here. We're looking for further support for programs delivered digitally, and we're looking for further establishment and involvement in any kind of virtual summit that's going forward. So they were our 4 key asks, and I know that the 2 governments have consulted very broadly with a variety of other institutions across Australia and across India ahead of that summit, and there will be follow-on commercial discussions with various different companies going forward. It's a very exciting time, although a very stressful time, to be doing business in Australia. So I hope I've answered your questions, Aurelia.
Absolutely, Petula, you have, and it has surely, we loved your PowerPoint presentation. It has surely shown us the steps that the government has taken. You've spoken so well about it, and it was very important to throw light on the virtual summit that was going to take place. Glad Infosys is doing their bit for that, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful to hear from you. Again, since we've heard from the Australian perspective, I'm going to delve right into the Indian aspect of understanding business in India, and also what steps has the Indian government taken. Of course, we've heard that from an Australian side. So what steps has the Indian government taken to combat COVID, and what have they done more particularly for corporations and employers? So over to you, Rajesh. If you could keep your speech a little, your session a little brief, because we're already running out of time. and I want to wind up by 11:30. So we'll need to have some space to take questions. So a brief intro, next.
Thank you, Aurelia. I think, yeah, I'm very cognizant of the fact that we have very little time, so I'm going to try and see how far I could get. If we could go on to my second slide. So I'm going to be basically talking about two things. One, on a looking forward basis, obviously we have gone back to work for good or for bad. From June 8th, I think most of India will go back to work eventually, despite the fact that the pandemic is ongoing. We're trying to get a handle on it. And therefore, my focus is going to be on two parts. One is in terms of the ease of doing business in India, because I think that is a focus area for the government to try and get back people into jobs. We are looking at a huge unemployment rate. We want to try and get that back in order. The other thing is in terms of the actions that the government of India has taken during the COVID period. And I think that's very important to look both of this in context, because I think that will give us a full perspective of what the government is trying to do. Now, on the first slide, on this particular slide, when we talk about ease of doing business in India, over a period of the last 8 years or so, the current government has been trying to improve the ease of doing business in index, and currently it's at around 63 today. There's a huge push for reforms and simplification of laws. For example, incorporating a company has become much more easier with a single form to fill all your documents, get your tax identification numbers, get your constitution documents, and so on. The government has also tried to make rapid strides in legal reform. For example, India grapples with a lot of labor laws. In the context of this webinar itself, we have about 44 central legislations and innumerable state legislation. So the intent here is to try and bring all of these labor laws into 4 simple codes, so that foreign investors and also Indian businesses feel more comfortable complying with these labor laws. The other things that are in the works include a national e-commerce policy, a direct tax code, data protection bill. I think these are some of the things that the government is trying to push through to try and expedite and enable doing business in a more simplified way. Also, in light of the changes around the world in global tax rates, India too has reduced tax rates to 22%. And again, new companies, manufacturing companies, the tax is almost at 15%, some of the lowest rates that we have in Asia. I think this is also going to be a huge push for getting foreign direct investment into the country. The other item is in terms of land allotment. So we have tried to now look at single window clearance systems for allotting land, both industrial and commercial land, for companies, which used to take a long time earlier. The other area where I think the government is focusing on is in trying to improve the process of customs, because pure trade, when it comes to pure trade, there used to be a lot of issues in the past with the Indian Customs Office. Now the Indian Customs single window project has been initiated, where both importers and exporters can get everything done on a single portal, which I think has made life much easier. Plus also the COVID pandemic has also given a huge impetus to everything digitized and electronic, right from our kids who are studying online to even the e-courts, which are being digitized. I think we're going to see, at least in the Indian context, a whole lot of services being moved virtually. Moving on to my effect, if you can pull up the next screen. I want to specifically, again, very cognizant about the time, want to talk only about the high level areas, which I think both India and Australia have in common, where we can collaborate as two large democracies. So the first area is pharma. I think everybody knows India is a prominent leader in the pharmaceutical market, occupying a 20% global share by volume, and around the country supplies 50% of the global demand for vaccines. So in the context of this particular epidemic, India has really been at the forefront in terms of supplying medicines. And I think in future also, with the vaccines that are coming in, there's going to be a huge thrust in India. The other areas which the government is trying to expedite foreign investment is in the areas of electronics, food processing. I want to specifically talk about mining because despite having some of the largest reserves of minerals in India, we tend to import quite a lot of them. For example, coal. Coal, we have the third largest reserves, but we still try to import a lot of them because India suffers from an acute shortage of skilled mining professionals. I think this is also another area where I think there's going to be a huge impetus because India has opened up 100% FDI in mining. And I think given Australia's expertise in mining, this is going to be another area where I think we can create a lot of employment. Few other areas include automotive and manufacturing sectors where I think there's a lot of synergies that can be developed. We could move on to my next slide. Yeah. Now we talk about when we look at the Indian COVID relief package, it's about $265 billion. And I think it's primarily aimed at both demand and supply revival of the Indian economy. The package is more of a stimulus package and does not, for a large part, involve cash payments. But given the paucity of time, I will only look at high-level changes here. There's been a lot of notifications by the Ministry of Company Affairs, the SEBI, the Reserve Bank of India, who've announced several relief measures since the epidemic began and continue to do so. But in the context of salaried workers and taxpayers, some relief has been given. The government has extended the deadline for filing income tax for the financial year 2019-20, and the date is now pushed to November 30th, 2020. The rates of tax deduction at source and tax collection at source have also been cut by 25%. The government has also given some support in terms of liquidity to the Employee Provident Fund, which is really a support measure for the employees. I think that should help employees all the way up to August. But in terms of trying to provide stimulus to the economy thereafter, the government is now looking up to the MSME, which is the micro, small, and medium enterprises, which I think contributes close to 50% of India's GDP. So the government is very cognizant that it cannot support the employees, nor can it ask the employers to kind of support the employees for a long run. And therefore, the government in India has tried to make sure that there is enough stimulus in the economy by encouraging the micro, small, medium enterprises to kind of create more employment. So one of the things that they've done is they've restricted all global tenders up to 200 crores, limited only to micro and small enterprises. So there is more business for them. And then the government is also trying to provide about 3 lakh crores as a stimulus package to the micro, small enterprises. What the government has also done is trying to enable the non-banking financial companies, including the NBFCs and the housing finance companies and microfinance enterprises by providing them with more liquidity so that they in turn can pump more money into the economy. So the approach of the government has been very different to many other countries that we've seen, but I think that gives you a very brief idea of how the government is really trying to tackle the issue. Over to you, Aurelia, because I think my time is up, and I think we should take some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you very much for keeping it brief, yet providing a very insightful and knowledgeable views and observations on how the Indian government has done whatever they did, and especially I was taken aback with the opportunities that you mentioned when it comes to mining, etc., and how we could create employment between India and Australia, and how we could use each other's expertise. That was really great and very relevant for all of us. So thank you very much, Rajesh. I do not want to waste any more time. We've got about 5-6 minutes, so I will take some relevant questions that I will filter from YouTube and from our private for those who have registered on our website. So I have one question here which I would like to direct to Satyajit. This comes from one CA Ramachandra and also from Raghav. They have 2 questions that they would there's basically one question that two people have asked, and the question is, how has or does the obligation to pay employees still continue during this COVID situation? So how has the government framed whatever guidelines they have, and how is the Indian government managing this? So does the obligation still continue to pay?
Thanks, Aurelia. So I'll try and give the answer. It's a slightly if and answer, but really the government regulations were quite clear that if employees were unable to come in to the workplace because of COVID and the resulting lockdown, they would need to continue being paid. That regulation or order was issued under the Disaster Management Act of India, and as such had a binding effect. The interpretation of that with certain practitioners took also was that, look, this would be, since it was characterized as payment to workers, it was meant to cover the blue collar employees. And that order continued almost till the middle of May or so. And hence, I think most reputed or sort of reasonable employees did continue adhering to such regulation. The other sort of portion or the other corollary to that was basically around the fact that certain employers and a large number of employers were able to create opportunities for employees to work from home. Now, in those situations, if those employees would refuse to work, what would be the position taken? Because the regulations, which I just mentioned earlier, specifically connected the payment to be made to employees who were not able to come in and work due to the COVID situation. So there are different permutations, there are different sort of scenarios which could arise. But yes, at a larger policy level, the government's intention was that employees, especially blue-collar employees, should continue to be paid through this period. Thank you, Aurelia.
Perfect. Thanks. I hope the questioner is satisfied. But yes, definitely provided the right answer, and quite in detail. Thank you, Satyajit. My next question, I have one from Neha, and that is that Rahul, this is for you. I'm going to direct this question for you. It says that the government has stepped in to cover some payments of salaries to workers. So can you throw some light on migrant workers and their visas in Australia?
Sure. Thank you, Aurelia, and thank you for the question. In terms of, there is financial support that is available that I mentioned before, under the JobKeeper program. That is limited to Australian citizens, permanent residents, and a limited category of special visa holders. There are a number of visas that are available into Australia for work and non-work. Generally, there is limited, if any, financial relief provided by federal government at this stage under the JobKeeper program. So the short answer, it is not available, although there are special categories of visa where it may be. What I have seen is at a perhaps more at a state and territory level, and also at a government services level, there is funding being provided through federal government and state territory government to support. So whether it is with respect to legal aid, so legal services that are provided, tenancy advocacy, food, health, those type of services that are available, but generally there is limited financial support available. It is a large challenge. We obviously don't have a massive population in Australia, but we still have a number of people that are heavily impacted, particularly, for example, in the hospitality space, where there is a lot of closures of businesses, or at least temporary closures. So it is having a significant impact on people, and there is limited financial support currently available.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much on that one. I have another question which I would like to take, which is again, Rahul, this is for you. It's come on and looks like a very relevant question. So, Rahul, how are the employers in the hospitality industry handling the employees, especially considering that the sector is most hit during this time?
Sure, sure. No, and look, I appreciate that question. I just saw that come up before, so I'm glad you raised it, Aurelia. Look, we work a lot with a number of employers, and I can say the first thing is how to support the employees is the first question we get asked. How to ensure the business is able to continue to run, and how is a business able to rebound? So the general view, I would say, I'd say more than general, the uniform view I have seen from all employers is how to support employees but keep the businesses afloat, and to look at what remedies are available under law, but more importantly, what government support is available, for example, through the job seeker. So that has been universally the response, and how to be able to get back to business as the restrictions are eased across the country. And again, it's different in each state and territory. Rachel mentioned before the three-stage plan announced by our Prime Minister, and that kind of gives a bit of a roadmap as to health and safety, hygiene, flexibility arrangements, but to support employers and employees to get back to business. So it's probably not a precise answer, but it's also the state of the world we're in right now.
Absolutely, absolutely, totally understood. I'm going to take another question, and I'm going to do this really quickly. So I have one for you, Satyajit, again. Can performance-linked pays of employees be deducted as a measure to cut costs, despite the fact that the employees have worked satisfactorily? What could be the legal repercussions? And this question is from Aditi Mukherjee. She sent it on YouTube. So if you could give us a response on that, it would be great.
Sure, sure. I've actually responded to her on YouTube, but just quickly to again share it with everybody else.
Yeah.
The performance-linked pay of employees is very clearly not dependent purely on the performance of the employee per se. It's also dependent on the performance of the organization, the team, the particular business vertical. So keeping that in mind, I'm sure many of us will see some adjustments to our I would say quote unquote fabulous performance pay, which is going to come at the end of the coming financial year. And of course, there should be reasonable explanation provided for the same. It shouldn't be done at the end of the year. I think employees should be explained, and I'm sure employers are even today and through the COVID times have been explaining to employees what is the impact this has had on their business. And I'm sure if the communication is done correctly in advance and clearly, I think this is something which most employees will expect at the end of the year, unless of course Q3 and Q4 turn out to be fabulous and really sort of turn the tide. But I think everybody should expect performance-linked pay to be impacted by the COVID situation. Back to you, Aurelia.
Great, thank you again. Thanks again, Satyajit. That question was for you. I have another one which I'm open to throw to anybody who would like to take it, which is from Dheeraj Dio. It says, if an employer wants to reduce salary of its white-collar employee, whether the employment agreement will apply or will statutory law apply? So not directly.
I got the question. I think I'll take this one very quickly. So Dheeraj, I think when it comes to a white-collar employee, at least insofar as the current scenario is concerned, most of them are looking to the employment agreements to regulate what happens with white-collar employees. I think Satyajit is also nodding in agreement. And I think given that we are seeing some disruptions in certain industries, there are going to be people out of jobs, and I think it's primarily going to be regulated by the employment agreement. So I think that should answer your question. And I think in terms of your legal recourse, you will have to look at your employment agreement.
I think we've received a question for Rachel. So, Rachel, I have a question for you from Neha again. What's your view on the large BPO contracts being cancelled or terminated and its impact on the employees? Would you like to take that up?
Sure. Thanks, Aurelia. So it's a really interesting question. I have to say, in Australia, we haven't seen the majority cancellation of such contracts in the services environment. So it's a bit hard to answer that question with any kind of authority, but it is concerning that some sectors of industry might actually take that view. In IT services, we certainly haven't seen that as an issue, but we are falling back on a number of force majeure clauses, on extended and proactive negotiations with all sorts of customers to ensure that we see fairness for us and our employees, as well as fairness for our customers. So there's a balancing act to be put in place, and we've had really positive experiences across all industry sectors, and we deal with many. So I really have to say I haven't seen BPO reductions perhaps to the extent that India may have seen them directly, but we certainly haven't seen them because we're regarded in many parts of the world as an essential service. I think it might be very different for wholesale reduction of services across other industries like mining, which have stood down huge numbers of their employees in Australia, and in the hospitality industry, who have also stood down huge numbers of their employees and are very heavily relying on the job seeker package to boost them.
Great. Thanks a lot, Rachel. I'm going to take another two questions before we can wind up. One, Petula, one is for you, so I'm going to ask you that, and that's really interesting because it says, so do you see a lot of Australian companies coming into India more?
During this period?
Maybe you can give us an opinion, on both, or in general.
I think, okay, I think there is interest because I think that stems right now from the situation where both the Australia and the Indian government are seeing each other as natural partners. So there's a lot of push towards that. There's the government focus on it, which again in turn has businesses looking at India, I suppose, with new eyes, looking to see that it is a tough market. However, there can be opportunities if you stay in for the long term. So we do see a lot of questions coming in. There is interest. The Australia-India Business Exchange, which recently took place with, the Honourable Simon Birmingham leading the delegation, had about 120 businesses come in. So that is testament to the, the potential that Australian businesses see in India. So I think, to answer your question right now, in this period, because of the restrictions, we don't see businesses coming, but there is intent. So we do have a lot of inquiries and, questions on what would be the opportunities and the potential. So there's definitely interest. And from the way I see it, once restrictions ease up, I think we would look to see both two-way delegations resume whenever that's safe to do so.
Wonderful. I think that's good news for India. If I hope it continues and it happens the way you said, so that's really good news for us. I'm going to take another question, which I'll throw open to Rajesh and Satyajit. And this is my personal question. This is not coming in from any viewer, so don't mind that. I'm just, because I have the opportunity to do that, I'm going to pose in my question, and it's the same that I asked Rachel. So So my question is, again, from an Australian perspective, Rachel answered that what has been the impact on large BPO contracts being cancelled or terminated, and its impact on employees and employers. So if you could give me an idea from an Indian perspective, that would also be great. Any one of you can just take up this question if you'd like.
So should I? I'll just go ahead and share some thoughts, and maybe Rajesh can then contradict me if required. So the basic and we are seeing some impact, to be fair, that we've had, especially on the hospitality side and the travel side. Definitely, there's an impact in terms of our customers and clients on that side. At a short term, on a short term basis, obviously we're able to divert those resources into other customers. So redeployments, etc., will definitely be happening. But long term, yes, I mean, we may have situations of people being asked to stand down, which is the Australian term, but the Indian term, a furlough or a layoff may be done. But we anticipate that by the third or fourth quarter, business should pick up, for us to get those people off the bench and back to work. But yes, definitely there will be, and there has been some impact already. Rajesh, over to you.
So Satyajit, I want to just again come back to you. Have you seen furlough being applied here in the Indian context? Because I mean, I've heard this concept a lot, but again, in the Indian paradigm, it's not really been applied. And I'm curious to know whether this has actually been applied by any organization that you've seen, market practice.
So yeah, so you're right, Rajesh. It's not used very often. As you would see, even if we see the legislation, it looks more manufacturing related, because the conditions under the Indian law for laying off, as we call under the Indian context, is for organizations which do not have work to offer the employee on account of lack of resources. That in fact the legislation talks of, I think, shortage of coal and fuel and things like that, and or a situation of a calamity and something around that. So yes, I mean, the conditions for application of a layoff or a furlough or a standing down in the Indian context is very, very limited, especially because and blue collar workers are, how should I put it, not the easiest people to convince under these circumstances. But yes, I think there's been a lot of questions around that. I'm sure, as law firms, you guys have also received a lot of questions around that. And I would see that not to, in the distant future, some organizations would definitely try to apply that. But yes, we will have to test it out and see how it goes. I think there are certain points around that which, purely if you read the Indian Industrial Disputes Act, you may feel that companies can, just put people on a layoff, but there are certain conditions to doing that. There are certain, obligations of the employer. There has to be a right of carrying out a layoff, which has to be captured in either the standing orders or the employment contract. So yes, it's not going to be very easy, but I would say that, look, at least it's better than mass retrenchments or separations of employees.
Great.
Back to
Great.
you.
Thank you. Before I end this session, I have one last question which I'm going to take up, and that would be for Rachel and Rahul from an Australian perspective. The question is: do you see a lot of litigations in Australia due to employees during this time? So maybe each one's perspective. Maybe we'll start with Rachel.
So I have to say we haven't anecdotally seen many, and that just might be my experience. And I think I'd rather hand over to Rahul, who's probably got a better idea of what is happening in an employment perspective in terms of litigations.
Yes, thanks, Rachel. But look, my view is the same as yours. Right now, we're not seeing a significant increase or changes in terms of employment disputes. Where there are employment disputes, they have happened before, and they'll continue in the usual course. But as a result of these circumstances, I feel, as a general, there is a view by employers and employees on navigating the challenges and looking for solutions that address an employee's requirements because children were being homeschooled for a month, and an employer's request to keep the business moving and still action requests by their clients. So that's probably the overall view I've seen, and I think the request for advice and assistance we have been providing has been consistent with that as well.
Great, perfect. Thank you, Rachel and Rahul. I think it's time to close the event. We've already exceeded 15 minutes from our timeline. So I just want to thank you for being a great panel. I hope all our audience has benefited. We sure did. Before I conclude the event, I wanted to point out that if there are any unanswered questions, we will be happy to take it up offline, and we will reach out to you with a response. I would also like to conclude this webinar with a note of thanks to Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Petula, for the support extended. I want to thank you all for being an excellent audience. I hope you enjoyed this session as much as we all enjoyed being here and having a discussion so that we all could benefit from. So thank you very much, and we look forward to interact again on another occasion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.